So we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Barrie Manikel. And this is continuing along the lines of soil management, but thinking a little bit differently about land stewardship and essentially how landowners are feeling about this kind of thing in rented land areas. And so we wanted Barrie to come and speak because he's done some really interesting work on this. If you don't know Barrie, he lives in the Red River Valley on the farm that he was raised on. And early in his career, he worked in crop protection. And then he started to actively farm, as well as worked in ag retail. For the past 20 years, he's been involved in a business development or as a business development consultant for AgCall Incorporated. And this has given him the opportunity to work across the entire ag spectrum. As an owner of farmland, he's maintained a very strong interest in soil conservation and land stewardship, and he is married to Joy. They have 4 grown children and 7 very active grandchildren. And Barrie, thank you very much for joining us today. You can take it away.
Well, thank you, Marla. Thank you for having me. Land stewardship has always been close to my heart, and also to the folks within AgCall. So, excuse me, in 2019, we started looking at farmland stewardship to see whether there might be a business case to be made. 40% of all of farmland in Western Canada is rented, and the owners are retired farmers, private investors. Some land is owned by the First Nations, some by some of the pension funds. So we thought, let's take a look and see if there's something that we could do that would support land stewardship and also have a business case. So they say that you can only manage what you can measure. And we were looking at ways of measuring land stewardship in a not a subjective way, in a way that could actually be measured quantitatively. We wanted to test whether a service to measure land stewardship practices using a third party would have value to renters and landowners. So we formed a team, and the team consisted of Gord Butcher, who's the CEO of AgCall, based in Calgary, and Gord has farmland up in that Birtle area. Melody McDonald, who farms with her husband just north of Portage. Sherry Rice, her and her husband farm near Drumheller, and myself south of Winnipeg. And we engaged over 25 AgCall associates across Western Canada to actually get face-to-face with landowners and land renters. So in phase 1, we said we really have to formalize this process if we're going to find out if there's a business case. We hired the Business Development Corp to give us a hand, and the process that they use was the same as, whether you want to set up another business. They're very focused at testing assumptions with formal interviews and testing things time and time again. So in terms of how we went about doing this, we met with land renters and we asked them questions. How are you competing to rent land? Are you up against the highest bid? Are you hemmed in by short-term leases? Can you demonstrate how well you manage the land? And we got quite a few different answers, but the main thing was that the amount of money that is paid in rent is the main focus of almost all rental conversations. And it's number 1, and number 2 is a long ways down the list. The other thing is that lease terms are getting shorter and shorter. And for the renter, it was difficult to plan long-term investments. So they were really feeling hemmed in by this. The fellows that were doing a good job of land stewardship said it was difficult to demonstrate that they were doing a good job, and there's no benchmarking that they could use. And most said stewardship practices are really an investment, and you need a longer-term lease in order to get a return on investment. But faced with shorter-term leases, renters were going to shorter rotations, and they're trying to maximize their short-term returns. And it's a bit of a sad story. Then we started talking to landowners, and we asked them if they cared about their land? Did they care if it was being managed in a long-term sustainable manner? Do you see value in monitoring the land management practices that are happening on your land? So for the most part, most landowners were very naive when it came to land stewardship issues. Historically, they said land is an investment which is always appreciated regardless of the farmland practices, at least up till now. Most of them felt pretty ill-equipped to evaluate the renters. They did it mostly by driving around and looking to see whether the renter had new equipment, and if he had new equipment and shiny paint and he seemed to be making money, they felt that, well, he's doing it right. And we found that only landowners with a long time horizon showed any interest in land stewardship. So if they were going to hold the land for less than 8 years, they really didn't care much. When we sat back and reevaluated things, we saw that land renters saw value and opportunity in our initiative, but they needed more information. We needed to segment those landowners to find those with a longer time horizon. We always had trouble contacting the landowners, but the renters that were interested in this could identify the landowners for us. And we needed to build a platform to guide our discussions. So in phase 2, we started to develop something to visualize the concept, and we called it our soil scorecard. It's not perfect, but it was our attempt of taking the different elements of measuring land stewardship practices and putting it together in one simple format. So we created a land stewardship scorecard infographic, if you want, and I'll go through this in the 3 or 4 segments of it. So we felt that as an independent organization, if we could verify the different aspects of land stewardship for both landowners and land renters, that there should be some value in that. So we should be able to charge something and get a return for our labor and capital. We knew that we would have to analyze the farm management practices that are being used on the farm. We had virtually no hesitation from the renters to say, if you can do this, you can have access to my records, you can download my climate information, my John Deere information, you can, I'm willing to share yields and what my inputs are. And we felt that it was necessary to have interviews with the renters to find out what they see as challenges to really doing a good job of soil stewardship. The second part of this is we were going to build online tools for both the landowners and the renters to help educate and keep both sides informed about current trends. After the first year of analyzing the information that we were going to collect, we would develop a small scorecard that would just sort of identify where that particular farm is relative to what would be ideal. So it's like looking at the way your soil tests look on your levels of nitrogen and phosphate, but this would look at more than just fertilizer. It would look at rotation and tillage practices, a whole bunch of things, and we would somehow come up with a score of, in this case, 8.2, and over time we would keep tracking it so that we could show the landowner that the land was being looked after and maybe even improved. Annually, we would have a review of the practices with the landowner and create an annual report for the land. We'd have a review with the land renter and create a report, maybe sit down, do a Zoom meeting with the landowner and go over how things are and maybe make some suggestions as to how they could change the lease to support additional land stewardship measures. And in doing so, we would hope to increase the land's productivity and therefore the land's value. So as we looked at phase 3, we knew that we had to segment the landowners into the different types that want to hold the land for a long time. We developed new interview scripts for each segment, and we sent out the soil scorecard infographic ahead of all of our interviews. And that was really helpful in sort of defining what we were going to be discussing. When we talked to the land renters, and they would say, come back and say, you know, I like the soil scorecard. I know I can do a better job of managing the soil than many others, and this would help me prove it. So they liked that. They said this could differentiate me from the competition and maybe help me secure long-term leases. It was interesting. We scheduled interviews for about an hour, and they often went, you know, over 2 hours. It's really a topic that renters are passionate about. 99% wanted to be better stewards of the land, but they just felt a lot of pressure due to the lease terms and the rates that were being charged. We had one comment that said, whoever takes this on needs to be 1/4 agronomist and 3/4 marriage counselor. Sort of speaks to the sensitivity of this topic between the landowner and the land renters. One fellow said, only 1 out of 3 of my landowners would consider it. The other 2 out of the 3 were just interested in the money. So renters were very interested, but they were still fearful of what the outcome could be in bringing this subject up with the landowners. So 90% of them liked it. They'd be part of it if the landowner appreciated the value, but that was the big if. So we decided to divide the landowners that have a long-term time horizon into 5 different segments. The first one is the landowner who's sort of a neighbor or lives in the community and you know, is still pretty connected with the farmland. And we looked at how concerned is this group with the land stewardship? And I would say for the most part, they are somewhat concerned. They want to keep the land in good shape. Would they be willing to extend the lease terms? And we found that if they saw a good reason to extend the lease terms to accommodate better land stewardship, they were generally open to that. Were they willing to reduce the rent? Well, that's a tougher question. For the most part, there was hesitancy. They felt that, yeah, I still want to get an income off of this land, and I don't want to go into the coffee shop and find out that I'm 20 bucks lower than the next guy. The discussion risk is what risk the land renter saw in discussing land stewardship with the landowner. And with these landowners, they felt that there was a fair bit of risk, but you know, on the right day, they could have a talk with them. The landowner's worry was really the fear of missing out. It doesn't take very long from being away from actively farming to get, you know, not as aware of the costs, not aware of the returns, not aware of what the land is renting for. And the renter's worry is that if I bring this up, is the landowner just going to go to a competitor farmer, and who's going to pay another 10 bucks an acre? So, you know, we saw that there were some issues even dealing with sort of the local landowner. Then we went to the more distant landowners, and these are landowners that say own land in Portage la Prairie, but they live in Vancouver. Probably the land was given down, you know, 1 generation, and the parents own the land. They're getting on in years, and they're trying to decide whether or not they should transfer the land to their children. For the most part, they were totally unaware of land stewardship. It hadn't hit the radar at all. And because of that, they really didn't see any reason to extend any lease terms. It was really difficult to get them to understand that maybe they are part of the solution of you know, proper land stewardship and maintaining the productivity of the land. And they weren't really wanting to reduce the rent. They depended on this annual rent check, and yeah, they didn't want to lose that. The discussion risk was seen by the renter as being very high. It was just something they didn't even know how to approach. The landowner's biggest worry is trying to stay current. They might come out and look at the land, once every 2 or 3 or 4 years, and certainly the children would need a very good map to be able to find the farmland. The generational expectations, the next generation, often expressed expectations that if they took control of the land, they wanted it to, they wanted land that was down in the Palisades Triangle to go back into grazing land. They wanted more organic, or they had some idea. And most of the renters said, when the land passes over to this next generation, I don't think I'll be able to manage I won't be able to meet their expectations. So the renters' worries were trying to stay connected and how to deal with the next generation. Looking at the private investors, and I just have a picture of Bill Gates because he owns 264,000 acres of US farmland. He's one of the biggest investors out there. We did talk to private investors, and when we talked to them about land stewardship, you're talking to them more as a business to business type of discussion. And they were concerned about land stewardship because they generally had a 20 to 30 year time horizon. And they would be willing to extend the lease if the farmer renting the land came back to them and said, if you allow me 8 years, I will be able to do this and this. They were fairly open to that. Not very willing to reduce the rent because they were holding on to the land as an investment and they wanted a return on it. But they were seen as, from the renter standpoint, as people that they could actually talk to about land stewardship and their plans. So the landowner in this case was worried about annual return, like they want to maintain a good return and they want an appreciation of the value of the land. The renters' worries were, in most cases, they were dealing with a lawyer who managed the leases, and the lawyers didn't understand land stewardship. They were subject to wanting to make everything fairly simple and just say, okay, the land is now renting for X number of dollars, without looking too much at what the productivity of that land was. So there were some issues there for sure. We met with several First Nations, and they were very interested in sustainable land management. They all initially said, they had a spiritual connection to the land, and that was the reason that they were holding it. And because of that, and they're also very long-term landholders, so they were concerned about stewardship, and they were willing to discuss it. And in fact, some cases they had land managers who were attempting to bring that into play a little bit more. The land managers on the First Nations were usually willing to extend the lease terms, not willing to reduce the rent, but they did see value in what we were offering if they could get a better handle on what similar land off the reserve was renting for and what the terms were. They wanted to be current, so they had that fear of missing out. And they did see value in it. The risk with the land renter was that the land managers made recommendations to the band council, and then usually the band council had the final say on what the rent was going to be, and in fact, who the land was going to be rented to. So the renters were worried about, if there's a change in the decision makers, maybe even though I've got all my plans made, I've been told I can rent the land for the next 8 years, a change in band politics could throw that all out. So they were concerned about that. Now we went out and talked to some of the organizations that manage the land for things like the Canada Pension Plan, those large pension organizations. And Their biggest worry is that they wanted to maximize the revenue, maximize appreciation, and minimize expenses. And in a word, if there's one way of characterizing their approach to land management, it's ruthless. They are absolutely ruthless, almost every one of them, but there is one notable exception. They were writing the lease terms to favor them. They were not concerned about land stewardship for the most part. If they saw a way of maybe burying some rock piles and making the land look better, they were keen on that. They weren't willing to extend the lease terms. In fact, they were much more ones that would look at leases on a 1-year basis. They weren't interested in reducing the rent, and there was no room for discussion. They were just focused on, we're going to manage the land to make the most money. Their land managers typically were getting paid a commission on the increase of rent that they would get every year. The demands on the renter was, I have to provide them with all sorts of information so that they know how much money I've put into this land, what my plans are, what my yield was, and these groups would come back and just say, okay, you made a bit more money this year than last year, so we're raising the rent. So they saw this as a no-win situation, and for the most part, they only rented the land if they absolutely had to. The one exception is Manulife Farmland Services, and this was really, boy, it was interesting to talk to these folks. They look at land at a 30+ year time horizon. They take into consideration everything from climate change to, will the renter be a good corporate citizen within their community? How does he treat his employees? Does he support community efforts? Does he buy local? A typical stewardship report on one of their land holdings would be 120 pages long, and they would interview employees, they interview suppliers. They do, from what I could see, a great job, but they're so far the exception to what I saw in any of the other discussions we had. So I would say, for the most part, land stewardship is not on the radar. It's not well understood. And like tides tend to raise all ships, land prices raise all land prices in the area, regardless of the practices being undertaken on that land. Most landowners said, I don't think I could get an extra dollar on the sale of my land, even if I had records going back 8 or 10 years. Maybe in the future, but right now they couldn't see it. So we had looked at this as a two-sided business model, providing value to both parties. Originally, we thought that we could maybe split the cost of this 50-50 between the land renter and the landowner. I'm not so sure that that's possible. We know that it must be driven by the renter, but he faces a buy-in from multiple landowners. So that was pretty problematic. We also saw that it's difficult to scale this up or to automate it. So that makes building it into a larger business a bit of a challenge. So AgCall has put this initiative on hold for now. Maybe somewhere down in the future we'll be able to get this going again, but that's where we're at this point. From an industry standpoint, we've talked to retails, we've talked to different people within the industry, and land stewardship is invisible to the casual observer. You can't really see the degradation of the land just by driving by, not until it's really bad. We've talked to some of the major lending institutions, so talked to Farm Credit, and they're not concerned about the long-term consequences yet, although they were interested. The retail agronomists don't want to risk losing business by suggesting better practices. So we saw a lot of that where it's easier to hide your head in the sand on this. Traceability programs don't align with land stewardship over time, so they're sort of a one-off type of thing. So, sort of summarizing, land stewardship is the elephant in the field. Everybody knows about it, but nobody talks about it. So the long-term impact of not addressing this is really huge in lost productivity, profitability, and in value over millions of acres. The renters feel that they're stewardship soldiers, but they're fighting the battle as an army of one. They really felt alone in this discussion. Renters need help in communicating and engaging with landowners, and engaging meaning bringing landowners on side as partners. So they say, how do you eat an elephant? That's one bite at a time. Now, my challenge to everyone here is, I think each and every one of us needs to take a bite out of the elephant by supporting farmers who practice good stewardship and be willing to engage landowners on the value of land stewardship for them, and encourage land agreements that support proper land stewardship. So let's all take a bite out of the elephant. It'll be worth it. Thank you.
Thank you, Barrie. I feel that this topic is so important. Maybe it's because of the fact that I work in the area of soil management, but thinking about the fact that we just had a session talking about opportunities or options, if there are options and opportunities to deal with salinity, and people are investing into making those decisions. And then if it's rented land, how do you make that, how do you make that decision? How do you invest that kind of money into it when there's only a short-term benefit to it, and you don't want the farmer to just go or the landowner just rent it to somebody else, and you lose that opportunity. There's questions here. Somebody just said, Terry said, I often suggest that landowners put in place some stipulations when renting to others, say farmer to farmer relationship. She's like, sorry, it's not a question, but this is, I think, an important situation where we have an agronomist who is engaging in those conversations with the farmer and the landowner. And I think that there is a role for our agronomists here in the audience to play in carrying that out. Question, what can the landowner who is concerned about land stewardship do with a renter that does not seem to be?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to change renters. There's such a demand for land that you can find a renter that would commit to proper land stewardship. And we saw that, the renters wanted to show that, demonstrate it, they just didn't know how. So I don't think there's a lack of supply of renters who want to practice good land stewardship.
Yeah, there's another comment here in the chat. The best landlord is one that has actually farmed the land previously and understands the renter's challenges. And I think that's also a good point. A few years ago, I actually participated in a meeting in Minnesota we were talking soil health, and they actually had a soil health field day for female landowners who were older women who were widows. And so they hadn't been of a generation that was actively involved in the farm. And they were having concerns about how to engage, like how do you judge and how do you engage with a renter on having these conversations, because they were concerned about the management of the land, wanted to have some kind of soil conservation effort being put in play, but didn't know how to start that conversation. And what I found was so fascinating is that we had an agricultural lawyer who was speaking to the group, and she was talking about some of these ways that you can have, start these conversations and engage in them. But what I found fascinating was she also brought up a group of people who had made conscious decisions when they were retiring from farming, not to hand the land down to their children who did not want to farm, and instead selling the farm, because they recognized that they had spent a lot of time working on building soil health and doing all these things that were very important, they were very passionate about, and they felt it was actually in the better interest of the land to sell it to a farmer who is more engaged in carrying out that same kind of activity, because they figured that the land would be taken better care of from a conservation standpoint if it was owned than rented. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. Because so many people want to hang on to that legacy of the land and pass it down. but is that actually going to be beneficial in the long run from a stewardship point of view? Okay, I'm not seeing other questions. We are into our poster session and break. Thank you again, Barrie, for joining us. Again, I find this stuff really fascinating, and the work that you guys have done at AgCall investigating all of this. It's so important, even though you guys aren't continuing it at this current point in time. I think that it's really great that we've been able to hear about the work that you've invested in looking at this issue.
Okay, thank you.